Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those within the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Welcome to Insights. I'm Sherry Stewart. This week we're taking a look at some of the shocking details behind a plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer. To date, 14 men have been arrested and charged with a plot that state and federal officials say was to kidnap the governor and overthrow several state governments. We'll be speaking today with a Lansing trial attorney who can break down some of those allegations. And later in the broadcast, we'll be speaking with a media professor who has conducted extensive research on extremist ideology. Well, joining me to kick off the conversation is Jamie White. He is a trial attorney out of Lansing, Michigan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sherry.
And sir, I know that you have litigated some very high-profile cases. In this particular case, 14 defendants now charged in this case. And the charges are very severe if proven. So can you give us some insight into how either side would go about litigating this case?
Right. So I guess first, Sherry, you've accurately described what the status of things are as they stand today. There was another individual charge bringing the individual defendants up to 14 now. It was 13 prior. We do expect that there will be more. Typically with these sorts of crimes, we call it the iceberg theory, where this is the tip of the iceberg. So for every individual charge, there probably are another 10 to 20 individuals who are either directly or remotely involved in this caper in some way, shape, or form. And we're seeing that play out now in that, another individual has been charged. These groups or these sorts of actors tend to be cowards. So it's very likely that law enforcement will, and to your question about litigating, I think that what we're going to see, Sherry, is that law enforcement and the U.S. Attorney and the Attorney General for the state of Michigan are going to ask for cooperation from all or some of these defendants for the purpose of identifying other individuals who are up to no good and trying to spoil any future efforts to commit these sorts of acts. So over the course of time, we'll see that, and that will play into defense strategy. I suspect that some of the defendants will aggressively seek to cooperate to mitigate their own harm and their own exposure. Some may be approached and be more reluctant to participate, but I think that will be a piece of it. I think that taking away the idea that we're just going to cut a deal and cooperate, the primary defense strategy, I suspect, is going to be that these individuals never actually went far enough to be indicted for a conspiracy. 6 of these men are charged with conspiracy to kidnap the governor and other charges by the U.S. government. In order to sustain those charges, the government has to show that they took a substantial step to actually commit these acts, not, sitting in a basement, no matter how bizarre it is, sitting in a basement, playing video games and talking about harming the governor is not a crime. But when you take acts to further that goal, that's when it becomes a crime. I believe that the government has evidence to support that based on what's been publicly disclosed, but that, I suspect, will be the primary defense strategy.
And that was going to be my question. I believe I've seen in one of a media report that this could have been perceived as just some tough talk. I mean, many people are displeased with some of the direction with regard to COVID-19 and how that's been handled, and businesses have had to shut down for safety measures and things of that nature. So obviously it's not a crime to be displeased with elected officials. That happens all the time. But I guess in this particular case, taking that step and even proving or showing that people really had ill intent, that perhaps is the deal breaker there.
Yeah, Sherry, that is exactly it. And here these individuals, these men, at least as it's been alleged, they raised money, they tested explosives, They surveilled the governor's vacation home, and I'm living in Michigan and familiar with that area, and knowing the governor, who's a friend of mine, how they even found that home is very troubling. But again, it goes to what were the affirmative acts? So somebody went out, found her home, and actually surveilled it at least on 2 occasions, as has been reported. So we'll see, but I think that all popular opinion is that these men did take the affirmative steps to actually execute this conspiracy to kidnap the governor, and not only kidnap the governor, but they in fact intended to try her for treason, move her out of the state. And what I would say to you, Sherry, is that what's been reported to me is that there was discussions about hanging her. So I suspect these men are going to be found culpable for the purpose of probable cause. They'll be held to trial. Some will cooperate, some won't, and accountability will fall where it falls. And
I know, Jamie, as you were starting out talking, you said this was pretty much like a tip of the iceberg type deal. In these particular cases, and it seems like it just, the layers keep unfolding. So in your mind, how are these cases really difficult to prosecute? Because there's so many, I guess, moving parts, or should you say layers, and you have to apparently have patience too, because this didn't just unfold overnight. Apparently, they have been under surveillance or investigation for some time, the folks that are being charged in this. Yeah,
they are difficult to prosecute. So domestic terrorism is a very difficult situation for law enforcement because, we are afforded the Bill of Rights, so right. Spying and this sort of thing that we could do with foreign nationals, is not allowed here, but for the involvement of the confidential informant here, I think that this could have been a very different conversation that we're having right now. I'm very grateful that person or persons, it appears, came forward. And I guess it's worth saying that while I certainly don't prescribe to any of these militia groups, they're to label them all in the same genre, I don't think is fair. It's an interesting group of folks that hold all sorts of unique points of view, but really, when you get granular, the minority really prescribes to these violent prescriptions. And again, I think we've seen this play out in this case in that, at least one person, if not two, heard we're going to kidnap the governor, and that was just a bridge too far for them. Mm-hmm. And they approached the FBI and ultimately became a confidential informant. So, as we continue to battle with these ideologies and try to confine them and avoid harm, I think it's important that we embrace the people who don't take that bridge too far and bring them into the camp of, how do we fix this? Well,
we're out of time. Unfortunately now, Jamie, we've got to move on, but we really do thank you for spending time with us today to break down, the ins and outs of how this particular case might be litigated as it continue to move forward. So we really appreciate your time today.
Anytime, Sherry. Thank you for having me.
Insights will return after these messages.
Well, welcome back to Insights. Joining me now is Dr. Andrew Selepak. He is a media professor at the University of Florida. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And so you were telling me that there are a whole lot of layers to unpeel in terms of when it comes to extremist ideology. So let's just start with, for example, some of the defendants in this case where they are plotting to kidnap the governor here. Published reports have said that they are a part of this Wolverine Watchmen militia group. Who are they, and what is the ideology behind this particular group?
Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that the state of Michigan actually has a long history of militia groups going back, way into the 90s. So in some respects, this isn't necessarily new. The tactics and the ideology of this particular group is different in some respects, only because we've seen a lot more encouragement and a lot more growth in a lot of these groups, whether, we've talked about the Proud Boys, we talked about Boogaloo. It's sort of this new wave that we're seeing of militia groups or nationalist groups or far-right groups that have kind of sprung up because in some respects, maybe because of the coronavirus, some respects because of their beliefs when it comes to the Second Amendment. A lot of it comes through this concept of absolutism, where the Constitution gives them certain absolute rights, absolute right to freedom of speech, absolute right to the Second Amendment and owning guns. And any restrictions on that or any kind of government intervention when it comes to preventing their absolute right to guns or freedom of speech, they take it as kind of a tyrannical government that they then have the sort of absolute right to defend themselves against. And, when taken to any kind of extreme like that, we can see where that kind of leads.
Now, since we don't teach that obviously in schools, and that's definitely not part of a school curriculum, so how is this ideology formed in your research? Where does this come from?
Well, again, because it's not necessarily new, we can look at militia groups going back to Ruby Ridge. You look at Waco. Waco is maybe a little bit different of an example because David Koresh and his kind of belief of his religious background. But this idea that the Second Amendment gives you an absolute right to defend yourself, that you can be a militia because of the wording of the Second Amendment, there's kind of a historical background to it. What we've seen more recently is the growth of it and the expansion of it because of the internet. The internet can put together people from disparate parts of the country or world and put them in contact with one another. Social media has just grown that ability even further because now you can connect on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And then there's lots of platforms that, many people may not even be as aware of that these groups are interacting on. An application, a messaging application like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook and used by over 1 billion people. It's a private messaging app where these individuals can share ideas, can talk about things, and can interact in an online environment. So what we've seen is that these types of ideologies, while they may seem strange to many people, are kind of in these parts of the internet that many of us don't actually visit very often or may not even be aware of.
And I know in our previous segment, we were talking with Attorney White. He described this group of defendants as cowards. So in your research and in your mind, how real are some of these threats that we've seen? Is their bark worse than their bite, or is this just, what is this?
I think it's kind of dependent on who we're talking about. You definitely have some individuals who have a membership or have a participation in this on a social media level, and it's never going to expand into any online or any offline action. It's just sort of being part of an overall discussion online, trying to associate oneself with some kind of group or ideology online. A lot of that comes from, you can look at sort of the academic research on the lack of community that many people feel. And they find community online, and that community could be something as simple as being a fan of a TV show, or it could be a political ideology, or it could be an extremist ideology. So one of the things that I think happens is you find a lot of individuals who are looking for something to be part of, and that might just be online participation. It's when it goes into the offline action that I think we need to be concerned. With this particular incident, we saw that they were training. They were involved in, training for explosive devices, training for shootings. So that's when it becomes obviously something that the law enforcement, the FBI has to become involved in, because we're then reaching a slippery slope of where this could lead to actual violence and actual action.
And you said something, Doctor, just a minute ago about some people are just simply looking for community, and it made me think for a minute. For years, we have had in different communities across the country, we've had just gangs in communities. So, and many times people that participate say that, hey, I looked for community, and that's why I became involved. And although many of the things that they participated in were not legal, but it was because they were searching for community.
And that's part of it. In some of the research that I've done in the past, I've talked to members who have been part of, extremist groups, terrorist groups. I've talked to members of, the Ku Klux Klan, and these were individuals who, were older, but they had participated in some kind of community in the past. A lot of times we see this from individuals who might have had, been involved in maybe a biker gang. They might have been involved in the military, and they're longing for a sense of community, a sense of sort of masculine community. And that's what many of these groups are really promoting. It's a sort of a hyper masculine community. You know, you have guns, you have weapons, you have military training. And there's sort of an area that, yes, you might see in gangs, you might see in extremist groups. So there is that aspect that I think a lot of people need to keep in mind, that some of these individuals, again, may never take any type of offline action, may never be involved in any actual attacks or movements or protests or any activity, but are looking for some way to connect with others. And, you know, from that perspective, I think it's one of those things that we've seen maybe more of this recently because of the coronavirus, because of the lockdowns, that people are spending more time online, that they're not even engaged in the minimal sort of in-person communities that they might otherwise, whether that's going to church, whether that's, you know, going to the local sports bar, whether that's going to a sports game. So when people are kind of limited in their ability to engage in anything, they're going to turn to what's available, and that's often online. And, you know, the way that, you know, without getting too deep into it, the way that a lot of social media works is it kind of feeds whatever you seem to be interested in, and it kind of sends you down that rabbit hole. So if you're somebody who already kind of believes in maybe some conspiracy theories, if you're already somebody who's looking for sort of videos, or you're looking for content in a particular ideology, social media is going to kind of keep you straight in that sort of framework and give you more and more of that content. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to radicalize you, but it definitely would sort of support and reinforce any beliefs that you might have, because you're now seeing more of it, you're seeing more people speak about it, you're seeing more people talk about it. And, you know, this particular group, while they weren't necessarily that active on social media, there are plenty of groups that are, and social media has been doing a lot more recently to remove them, at least from the popular social media channels. Facebook has been doing a lot, Twitter's been doing a lot, but these groups still are active, you know, whether it's on WhatsApp, whether it's on 4chan, 8chan, you know, they can be active on Telegram. There's lots of opportunities for online discussions, interactions, and engagement that, you know, kind of does create this opportunity for them to get this content.
Okay, well, that's a great place for us to take a break. When we come back, Dr. Selepak, we want to talk about some of these groups. We want to talk about the Proud Boys. We want to talk about the Boogaloo movement and others in terms of what they are doing, and you can educate us on that.
Insights will return after these messages.
Welcome back to Insights, and we're continuing our conversation today with Dr. Andrew Selepak. He is a media professor at the University of Florida. And before the break, Doctor, you were talking about some of the ideology, and so now we want to delve into some of these groups. We know that there is the Proud Boys, there's the Boogaloo movement. So let's just start with the Proud Boys. Who are they? What do they do? Where are they?
So again, this is sort of an organization that didn't start as we view it now. There is a person who used to work at Vice. Now he has a YouTube channel, creates YouTube content, Gavin McInnes. And he wasn't necessarily, he's sort of considered the founder of it. He's also kind of considered the founder of the hipster fashion, if you can believe that. The movement really kind of started, Proud Boys really started because McInnes would be invited to go speak at different places in New York City. And the individuals that were really more of like just bar buddies, more than anything else, would come, and because he's a little bit far right, he speaks about conservative issues, there would be protesters there, and these individuals who were kind of like bar buddies would show up and kind of be a counter protest to the people protesting him speaking. And it's really kind of blown up from there, far beyond his control, far beyond his ability to kind of lead any kind of group. And the Proud Boys really kind of started from there. It was, most of these things don't start necessarily as what they finally wind up as. Mm-hmm. A perfect example is actually the origination of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1860s. It was 4 individuals in Tennessee who really weren't able to do anything because of the restrictions of Reconstruction. They had been, you know, members of fraternities when they were in college, or at least some of the members were, and they basically started their own kind of fraternal group for, you know, ex-Civil War soldiers, and it led to what became the Ku Klux Klan. So a lot of times these organizations don't start as what we see them later to be. Sometimes it's a lot more of an innocent beginning and a lot more of a dangerous ending.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, because I was going to ask you, but so many of these groups, while they may have started with good intentions, they definitely don't end up that way. So where does the violence come in at? Because when you say Ku Klux Klan, most everyone I would know would, you think of violence. And so where is it that they have originated with good intentions?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say good intentions. I would say that the origination of these groups is often a lot more innocent than what it turns out to be. Whether those innocent intentions are good intentions, I think that would be something that I would more often than not probably disagree with. But I think what happens, as with kind of any group, is you generally have individuals who sort of are the loudest voices in the room. And sometimes the loudest voices in the room aren't necessarily the ones that have the most innocent beliefs or innocent ideologies. But depending on the charismatic nature of the individual, they can wind up being the leader of the group, and their views become sort of what the group takes on. With Waco and David Koresh, you have a very charismatic person who becomes the leader of the group, and his ideology kind of spreads throughout the rest of the membership. And I think that's something that typically happens with a lot of these organizations. They have sort of one figurehead, and that the beliefs of that figurehead then kind of spread out to the rest of the membership. And depending on, what that person believes, you could wind up having a very dangerous organization, or you could have an organization that, we never hear of, we never know exists, because they're not really doing anything.
Yeah. So while they may start out as, this ragtag team of community bullies, but they definitely end up to be something much more sinister. Let's move on. Let's continue talking. What about the Boogaloo movement? Explain that for us.
So again, this is kind of one of these weird things that really kind of grew up out of the internet. They basically took their name from the Electric Boogaloo movie, and their quote unquote uniform is wearing Hawaiian shirts. Which kind of limits anybody else wearing Hawaiian shirts right now. But they kind of believe in an upcoming race war, and their goal is to kind of incite the violence that will lead to that race war. But interestingly enough, this is, again, not a new concept. We see that there's skinheads that believe this, neo-Nazis, other patriot movements. So again, you have a lot of these things that we're seeing are not necessarily new. It's just whether or not people are aware of similar groups and other things. I think that with the internet, we're maybe becoming a little bit more aware of it. But what's important is for people to understand that, there's individuals out there, and they don't necessarily believe the same things we do, because they're getting content from online, they're getting content from social media that are spreading conspiracy theories, they're spreading weird ideals and weird beliefs. But because people sort of become indoctrinated through almost an echo chamber, we call it, where they're hearing the same messages again and again and again, and they become radicalized in these beliefs because they're just only hearing one side, and they're hearing this one view again and again. Pre-internet, pre-social media, that individual may have some of these beliefs. They may talk about them a little bit privately with a couple friends. But the fact that they can go online, they can see other people discussing them, and then they might become even more indoctrinated because of these messages that they can get again and again and again, depending on who they follow and what they're watching, is, I think, led to so many more of these groups right now. But again, a lot of these groups are mostly online. A lot of these groups, in terms of the membership, is mostly online. The total number of membership of these groups is generally pretty small. But, it doesn't necessarily take a lot. It doesn't take a lot of people to create a big disturbance, to create violence. And I think that's where the big concern comes from. We're talking about a group that was, not that many members, but, the violence that they could have potentially done in terms of kidnapping the governor of Michigan. There was talks about maybe doing the same with Governor Northam in Virginia. I mean, it would not take very much to cause a great disturbance and tremendous violence and tremendous destruction. So even if we say there might be 400 members, if only 15 of them act, that can cause a tremendous amount of damage.
What in your mind are some of the things that we can do to, I guess, maybe to be aware, or so that perhaps young children, I believe parents don't want their children to be influenced by this type of ideology. So is it a more control on social media? What would you recommend?
Well, I think for parents, one of the things is you've got to know what your kids are looking at on social media. You've got to, and part of that comes from parents need to also know how social media works. They need to be familiar with the platforms, how their child could be interacting with people, not just sort of publicly, but privately. A lot of these groups are kind of discussing things in private messaging apps. So it's important for parents to know what they are. It's important for parents to know how they work. It's important for parents to know that their child could be getting messages from anybody. And, while we think about, from a parent's perspective, the same is going to be true for really anybody who feels lonely. I mean, a lot of times these individuals that join these groups are longing for something. Mm-hmm. So if you're a high school counselor, if you're a college counselor, if you're a teacher, a professor, if you're a concerned friend, a concerned family member, anybody who feels isolated is going to look for something. And they're going to look for a group to latch onto, an individual to latch onto, maybe an ideology that explains why they feel like they're being persecuted in some way. So it's those that seem kind of standoffish. It's those who seem disillusioned. It's those who seem kind of like the loner, I think, that needs to be the most concerned about. But there's lots of things that parents can do. There's lots of things friends, family, and those concerned can do.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Dr. Selepak, we're going to have to leave it there. We want to thank you so much for spending time with us today and shedding some insight into these different ideologies.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, that does it for this week's program. If you have a question, comment, or story idea, you can email us at news@wbkb11.com. I'm Sherry Stewart. Thank you for watching and have a great week.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.